Lecture 11, Global Sport and the Environment. In this module, we'll be going over global sport futures, and I think this is important and it builds on some of the themes and issues we've gone over so far. Now please note that this final module only has 2 lecture topics within it. Now the purpose of this final module is the following. We have to recognize that in understanding the present, this is a way of looking towards and shaping and influencing and in fact creating the future. This is important because you learn not just for knowledge's sake and to learn more about the world in which you live, but the purpose of education and the purpose of learning is that you can go out and affect change within the world you live and in whatever way or capacity that you take up positions in your professional future lives. That, in other words, you are able to enact change from the knowledge that you've acquired. As it says here, studying sport and globalization matters because it's about the future. It's about understanding the past and the present in the service of the future. I think that's an important thing to recognize because in some degree, education is a commitment to the future. Now this is all a bit abstract, I guess, but I think it's important to think about and remember because that's where you are going. You're taking this knowledge and this information into the future. I think this is clearly important and something to think about when it comes to the environment and its relationship to global sport. Because the environment is something that we need to care for in the future, perhaps better than we have done so in the past. Here's the outline for the lecture, 5 sections leading to the summary. First, unpacking the environment. This section is going to be an overview of the environment and environmental issues, but I want to think about it from a global perspective because perhaps more than anything else, the environment in which we live is a global interconnected sphere. Now, we remember that definition of globalization as global interconnectivity. Its interdependency plus complex connectivity creates this global complex interconnectivity. That is what characterizes the global age, a complex web of interdependencies and interrelationships. And one of those forms of interconnectivity and interdependence was identified as environmental interdependence. So there's a flow and network of environmental features that link us together around the globe. There are those interdependency chains that are networks that link people from distant parts of the globe. And I think the environment is a clear part of that. So these global interdependency chains are, in other words, the networks that have interconnected people from distant parts of the globe. Because the environment is all about interdependencies, the pollution enters the atmosphere, raising the temperature, causing global warming, affecting climate change, which melts the polar ice caps. And the rising of water levels around the world and temperatures as a result of those emissions fundamentally affect other people around the world. So you can see very easily how there are interdependencies all around the world. And so the argument here is that care about the environment in now Central Africa will have a knock-on effect benefit for creating a healthy climate more generally for people elsewhere around the world. So we live in other words, an era of environmental interdependencies, just as we do all these other interdependent networks. So what is the environment? And in very brief terms, far be it from me to define a heavily scientific term, but this is what we're referring to within this context. The environment refers to the natural world and the complex interaction of the following spheres: the bio, the hydro, the litho, and the atmosphere. And you might not be that familiar with each of these, and it may be a long time since you've had a natural science course, but you need to be familiar with them because the environment is the interaction of all these different spheres. So we can see them one by one. The biosphere is simply the totality of ecosystems, zones of life marked by interaction between living organisms and the environment. So the relationship between biological organisms and the environment. The atmosphere is simply the body of air surrounding the planet, which allows for life to flourish in the biosphere. The hydrosphere would be considered the various forms of water existing on, below, or above the surface of the Earth. And finally, the lithosphere is the solid rocky crust covering the planet. Now, all four of these together make up the environment. So let's look at this then. And I like this graphic because it shows all different spheres and their interactions. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the natural environment, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the lithosphere that work in concert with living beings, or the biosphere. Now, the argument is that human civilization has, in a minute way, affected the natural environment throughout the dawn of civilization. However, really, the huge environmental change came about during the period of industrialization. And what we're talking about here in American context is really from the early 1800s on, where the process of modernization, industrialization, and urbanization has had a massive impact on the environment, on local and global environments. The industrialization of the Western world and the factory system at the heart of that, for example, caused all sorts of environmental changes and transformations based on the extraction of fossil fuels, wood, and the burning of these sources of energy and the pollutants of the atmosphere. The transformation of the environment that were human-based started in earnest from the early 1800s and continued onwards. Now, one of these is deforestation, which is stripping the biosphere. So between the 1600s and 1900, the forested area of the US declined from 46% to 33%, which is a pretty huge and significant change. And these trees were harvested to provide timber for housing, industry, railroads, and also to clear land for farming. Now, you get rid of the forest so you can have land that you can farm and put cattle on. And a key reason for deforestation was so you could provide the raw materials and food for that industrialization process. So here you can see the deforestation of the US from 1620 to 1920, and it's pretty stark. I mean, look at this significant change. Again, two things fueling this majorly: industrialization, and of course, so the fuel for factories and the construction of material goods and commodities and their transportation to markets, but then also the need for arable land for farming. In the early 1900s, there's an early recognition, and the US government is often criticized for not having a very strong environmental policy. However, it was one of the first governments of the world to recognize that the environment needed to be protected and preserved for the betterment of US society and the world society. And that was an early environmental initiative. But developing nations in the 20th century and into the 21st century, as they modernized and industrialized, became ever more exploited in their natural resources, as it says here. So the globe was and is being stripped of its natural resources, and more of them are being consumed. And these carbons are polluting the atmosphere as the world develops. So that's the issue here, and that's an issue we have to deal with and are dealing with. But it's not just the US where deforestation took place. Also in the Amazon, here you have the Amazon rainforest, and it's slightly slowing down, but apparently the loss of the rainforest is due to the clearing of land for cattle, soybean farming, and the illegal logging that carries out still at a remarkable swift pace today. So this is significant for a number of reasons. Firstly, deforestation can lead to this thing called desertification, the creation of deserts as a result of stripping the land of its flora and fauna. The tree coverage hides it from the sun, so without them, the land becomes sun-baked and unable to grow anything on it because it has no coverage and no sources of water are kept from the tree roots. So desertification can result from deforestation, and that particularly is seen in Africa, where we see zones of desertification created not naturally, but by the rapid deforestation and the creation of these desert-type environments. And this is worrying because clearly tree coverage around the globe is very important, and the deforestation is significant for this reason. For example, the Amazon rainforest is the largest absorber of carbon dioxide on the planet. So imagine cutting down the largest absorber on a regular basis, then where does that carbon dioxide go in the atmosphere? It stays there and it heats the planet, and this leads to global warming, climate change, and the greenhouse gas effect. So if you get rid of carbon absorption, it's a global problem because global warming affects all of us around the world. We are interconnected to one another. So massive deforestation in the Amazon leads to problems all around the world, not just in the Amazon region itself. Now, another thing to think about is the distraction and usage of the finite resources that we have on Earth. These fossil fuels are key sources of energy that drive mechanized mass production of the industrial age. These are things like coal, petroleum, and natural gas. Now, if we go back and look in the early 1800s, the American economy was all about the rapid extraction and depletion of coal as a finite resource. And here we have a picture of some Illinois miners. Later in the 20th century, oil took over as the primary energy source within the economy, within industrialization, and we have mass extraction of American oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma and other places. It was the rapid depletion of these finite resources because we're not making any more new oil or coal once we use it up, and we're using these fossil fuels extremely quickly. And here it demonstrates that our energy consumption between 1975 and what's expected to be in 2300. Our fossil fuels are on a rapid decline, and we're on a downward curve, and we're soon, within a couple hundred years, going to use up all the fossil fuel energy sources that we currently have. And you can see in terms of the planet, we are depleting the planet of its finite fossil fuels. That's one issue here that we have to worry about, that sometime in our future we may run out, but for them now, what we do with these fossil fuels affects the atmosphere, and industrialization pumps these pollutants into the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. So industrialization is a main source of environmental pollution. The manufacturing process creates toxic emissions, polluting the atmosphere basically. So it's not only industrialization, but the products of industrialization doing the same thing. The key one being the internal combustion engine, and the key thing about the 20th century was all about the manufacturing and spread of the automobile, which burns oil in the atmosphere. So manufacturing it is a source of pollution, but running it is a huge source of pollution as well. So you can see car culture has had a very negative effect on the environment. But so do these seemingly benign consumer goods as well. These require energy to be used. Even the low energy bulb requires some energy, and that energy has to be created somewhere in power plants that use fossil fuels and unavoidably pump pollutants into the atmosphere. Everywhere we go in modern life, we are surrounded by energy and the pollution that energy creates. Even our leisure choices, from cruise ships to RVs to motorcycles to airplanes, many of our leisure choices involve significant elements of consumption of fossil fuels and their pollution into the atmosphere. So if you think about all these different things from the manufacturing, consumption, and even our leisure, you can see how there's been a massive increase in the greenhouse gas effect. Basically, this means that carbon dioxide and other pollutant gases are trapped within the Earth's atmosphere, and they can't go anywhere, and they raise the Earth's temperature. They're not absorbed as much as they used to be because of deforestation and the lack of carbon absorption within the shrinking tree coverage around the world. So, not only are we producing more greenhouse gases than ever before, but they now have nowhere to go. So they sit in the atmosphere and they raise the temperature because they insulate the Earth from the sun. So that's the main problem. That's all linked back to pollution. So here we have a demonstration of graphs looking at the rises in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And even if we don't have the same level of pollution as and even if we didn't have the same level of pollution as we do today, these levels would be rising, but not nearly to the same level that they have risen in these graphs. So you can clearly see greenhouse gases have an immense impact on the environment around the world, and it's largely understood in terms of global warming. Now, people will deny its existence, or they may attribute this to non-human actors, but most scientists will unequivocally tell you this is indeed a fact. Now, here are some of the indicators of global warming: the heating up of the air in the atmosphere, the lowering of the glaciers and snow cover, and the rising in the level of the oceans. So raising water levels coming from melted snow and ice caps around the world impact the level of the water level of oceans. This high temperature melting of the hydrosphere is causing a raising of sea levels around the world. That's one of the most significant things that's going to have a huge impact on people's lives, particularly as most cities around the world are located on waterways or on coastal levels. But another thing is the steady upward rise in temperatures as well. So, what does rising temperature mean? It means melting ice caps, which leads to rising sea levels, and rising temperatures also lead to desertification. So, the world's going to look a lot different in 20 to 40 years. Even the boundaries between sea and land are going to change markedly over the course of our lifetimes. All as a result, scientists would argue, of human industrial development on the environment. And as you already know, people are angry about this. Naomi Klein's recent book says it's really an issue of capitalism against the climate. So, what we're seeing here is the rising temperatures, the rising emissions and pollutants within the atmosphere, the rising greenhouse gases, all a result of unregulated, unfettered, uncontrolled capitalism. It's a polemic argument since she takes one side of it, and it's not the only side. People would argue that there is the opposite, but this is the side that she provides us, and she says capitalism is at war with the planet, specifically the planet's environment, and the planet's environment is losing the war. There's another form of pollutants, however, and it's affecting the lithosphere, and this is waste. Because many of these things that are industrial capitalist consumer societies are built on, it's the manufacturing and consumption of stuff that has to be viewed as being disposable, because if we don't continue to buy and dispose of things, we continue and buy new things, then the world system grinds to a halt. So there's a planned obsolescence within our system and a dynamism within consumer culture that means we regularly spend, buy, and consume the same things, but we want to dispose of what we previously had to get the new model, even though the older model may not be redundant or obsolete. In fact, the entire premise behind capitalism is to make you feel insecure, that what you currently possess is outdated and less desirable than new products. And so we have this stuff culture, a consumer culture of disposability linked to capitalism and the drive for continual consumption in marketplaces. And we're all guilty of this to some extent. We want more and more, and we either throw it out or give it away, what we used to have, so we can buy more. And that's the culture of industrial capitalism or consumer capitalism that we're in. So this doesn't do us a lot of good because we spend a lot of money, but it also doesn't do a lot of good for the environment for this reason. And because it's all about consumer capitalism, it's waste culture, because all we're doing is producing huge amounts of waste from these forms of consumptions that we dispose of, and lots of waste goes to a landfill and it fills up the world. And eventually the world will fill up and become one giant landfill, and there won't be any more room because in 500 years' time we'll have consumed and disposed of so much of it. This is a helpful video that traces the story of stuff from its extraction to its sale, its use, its disposal, all the stuff in our lives that affects communities in our homes and abroad. Yet most of this process is all hidden from our view. We don't consider it. So I like this video because it highlights really the entire process of a commodity from start to finish. And as you may have known, this was the premise behind the entire movie WALL-E. It was a vision of the future of consumer culture on Earth, the compromised lithosphere, landfill Earth that we can call it. The argument being here in this movie that we may not get to that, but perhaps we will, not in our lifetimes, but sometime in the future, we'll consider the impact of consumer culture and its disposability and impact on the planet. Having given you a very brief overview to the environment in the relationship between modern industrial capitalism and the effects on the environment, let's talk about sports and the impact of sports and the impact sport has on today's environment. Here it says a really good quote from McGuire et al. Basically what they're saying is, like transport, housing, leisure, recreation, all the sporting activities all engaged in the use of physical environment. And if it's done in a haphazard, unplanned way, could potentially be a threat to planetary existence, and at the very least, it's a threat to that physical and social plant-like environment that we live in. So what they're saying is that sport takes place within a physical environment, and its impact isn't necessarily related to that physical environment. So we have to think about how it can be managed so that it doesn't have negative effects and impacts on our lives. What we're looking at in this topic is how sport has an effect on all these spheres. And I think sport can be seen in various different forms to impact these different spheres. Let's start with the sporting goods industry. The sporting goods industry, which we've mentioned a number of times within this course, is a major entity within the global sport economy and global sport culture, and it's all about the extraction, manufacturing, and pollution and waste of physical goods. I think this is a great quote here that the sporting goods industry is characterized by mass volume production and distributed manufacturing across geographic regions, which involves high levels of resource consumption, waste, and other environmental emissions. So, what they're saying is that the global industry that extracts raw materials from all around the world at high levels, it creates a lot of waste and other forms of emissions. Sport shoes are going to have a negative environmental impact, and that's the argument. What we often don't see is the waste in the production process. We assume that we buy these shoes, we wear them for a period of time, and we throw them away. But what the Story of Stuff video previously discussed points out is that there's also pollution and a throwaway culture associated with the production of those shoes in the first place. And so all around the world, through that production process, there is waste being produced. And this is even more so because the industry is characterized by large volumes of production and large levels of consumption. And they have very short product life cycles. So what tends to happen is the industry constantly reinvents itself with new products, so the life cycle of the product is short and it's replaced by another one. People are constantly looking for the new thing. As a result, there's high levels of waste within the industry. Every time someone throws out an old pair of sneakers to get a new pair, you have just created waste. Because of the very short product life cycle and highly disposable rates and higher levels of waste that are part and parcel of this industry, because you don't then have an industry that will be profitable if you didn't convince consumers that they needed to continually consume at rapid rates. How does it have environmental effects? Well, in these ways, and I'm just going over this again. In the industry, it extracts resources and uses it for production and distribution. So the resources could be various forms of rubber or oil for plastic or gas for the distribution of these products. And throughout these processes, there are various levels of toxic emissions that are resulting from the manufacturing process. And ultimately, there is waste of consumer products that is created in the end. There's disposals of waste products within the manufacturing process, but the consumer products that ultimately become waste and are disposed of at the end of that process. That is effectively the waste culture that we live in. Now, if we break it down a bit more, as an interesting article here shows, this is the breakdown of a running shoe from part to material. Many of them are man-made materials that are often created through the use of chemical oils and refined in particular ways to create them. So the manufacturing process creates an awful lot of emissions and pollution that we, the consumers, never see and we often don't consider. The article goes on to say that these shoes create a considerable amount of gaseous emissions. So from the cradle to the grave of a running shoe, they argue that this shoe creates 300 pounds of carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to keeping a 100-watt light bulb on for a week. Now, there's a lot of pollution for one pair of shoes, especially when we produce roughly 25 billion running shoes a year. 25 billion times 30 pounds of carbon is 750 billion pounds of carbon per year within the atmosphere. And that's a huge amount just from the production of shoes over the course of 1 year. And it's not simply per year, it's only those 25 billion created in that year. So if you imagine there are 25 billion shoes existing within Earth at any given time, you compound those and you multiply them year on year, and we've got massive amounts of CO2 emissions simply from the production of shoes in the atmosphere at any given time. Let's put it this way, regardless of the figures of the global sporting goods industry, it creates a huge amount of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere and clearly creates a higher level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So there is this industry, is your example, the impact of that sport has on the environment. And remember, this is just running shoes, not all forms of sporting equipment or apparel, they'd be contributing as well. Another example is international tourism. This is very different because we're going from a shoe and its environmental impact, and here we're talking about international sport tourism, which is quite a different type of a thing. There are various forms of tourism: event, active sport, and nostalgia tourism. Event tourism, as the name implies, tourists who travel for the purpose of a sporting event. This is becoming a huge part of global sport culture. International sport tourism, to go to an event, is a massive industry, and that's becoming more popular as the developed world becomes more affluent. So what are the impacts on event sport tourism? Well, a key one is the notion of carbon emissions that are released as a result of the event. These are the main areas where carbon is produced in relation to these major sporting events that these international sport tourists go to. Number one is the sport facilities construction and operation. Basically, the facility that you're watching the event from had to be built, and the building process that creates considerable amounts of carbon emissions and does so in its daily operation. Also, these major events have a complex transportation infrastructure that needs to be built and operated and again create these emissions. A massive one is spectacular travel and accommodation, and specifically the travel because people are coming from all over the world, oftentimes from jet planes, which emit a lot of emissions. So you can see that bringing 80,000 people from around the world to watch a particular game has a massive effect and a massive carbon footprint. And then you take into account the hotels that are running and all the various operational aspects, the sundry operational aspects of everything, and that it takes to put a major event on, and this all adds up. Which means that in today's context, all these major global events, they have a carbon footprint plan and strategy on how to reduce it. This is true of the World Cup, and you can find online a previously submitted report in 2014 on the carbon footprint of the Brazil's hosting of the FIFA Men's World Cup. And what it says was that they had an estimated over 500,000 visitors, 2.7 million tons of CO2, and 60% of it came from transportation. So you can see that as an event, the World Cup isn't having a great effect on the world's environment. This is a nice graphic from the 2010 World Cup, where 67.4% and 1.85 million tons of CO2 came from international transportation. Clearly, it's the biggest source of carbon emissions for these events because they're international events. They generate international interest, and international travel creates this global pollution. So somebody has even argued that too much football is ruining the climate, and you could argue that this is indeed the case. The fact that we have these international tournaments that create all this international interest in travel isn't having a very beneficial effect on the climate. However, people have also argued that there's been a result of this international event tourism and the events that are put on to serve these tourists, there's been a destruction of local environments. And Hyman and Hinch identify this in a number of ways. They say that the destruction of the physical environments and potentially the biggest issue that they see is the compromising of the biodiversity of those environments. The uniqueness of these environments is being compromised, they argue, by the destruction of them through these major events. There are numerous examples of this that you can find out there, but here are a few of them. In Sochi 2014, they were talking about how the development of the Sochi Olympic site meant that this park in the Caucasus was compromised, and it was taken over and developed as a need to create the Olympic facilities. They argued this was very damaging to the biodiversity lost in the area, and the national parks part of it had been completely destroyed. And this area was the most diverse in terms of planet and animal life in all of Russia. Now we can say, who cares? You were losing a couple tree frogs or squirrels in Russia and it doesn't have an impact. Well, the impact is significant because those are lost to the global environment, not only to Russia. And if we cared about biodiversity, and we understood biodiversity as being interconnected and an interrelationship between not only Russia but elsewhere in the world, there is a knock-on effect of the degradation and environmental reduction in a place like Sochi. And we can see here on this slide, they're looking into stopping Olympic destruction of biodiversity in the area. But this isn't the only type of environmental destruction that the loss of biodiversity in Sochi includes. There are multiple forms of illegal dumping on some hills above Sochi and some of the local rivers, and there was no construction waste that was placed here that had a very negative pollutant effect on the local environment. In this video, it looks at how the pollutant effect impacts people in their everyday lives, from the running out of water through the dumping of trash, and really the splitting of the entirely rich biodiverse mountainside to develop a high-speed rail that connects the Olympic ski slope to the Olympic village that effectively cuts in half this rich biodiverse forest. And if we go forward to Pyeongchang in 2018, where the Olympics was held, we have the area where the ski run was staged, and it's built to be within, and it was built within these mountains again for the Winter Olympics in South Korea. Large sections of this forest, and this forest is identified as being one of Korea's most important and diverse biospheres. So it was identified, and this is where the ski run was going on. Large sections of the forest had been cleared to make way for the Olympic ski course. But protesters didn't like it, and there was significant opposition to it. And you can see in this clip here, they talk about the opposition and why it's important to preserve the biodiversity within this area. But as you can guess, the Olympics have considerable clout, and regardless of the protesters, this land was cleared to create the ski runs. Here, the protesters arguing 3 days of ski games are less important than 500 years of primitive forest. So the question is, what's more precious? And this is the reality of the development as it comes and it relates to major global sport events. But they want to create an event that will attract tourists to visit during the event, and it also attracts the spectacle that spectators are going to want to watch on television. The last example we have is the Rio 2016 golf course. It was built strangely in an environmentally protected area. That's where they built the golf course. So the fact that it was an environmentally protected area, it really meant nothing. It has been raised and turned into a golf environment from its natural environment. Now, as you'll see a little bit later, golf courses are a massive drain on the environment for a variety of reasons. So this notion that you were using an environmentally protected area and turning into lush green developed golf course is a bit counterintuitive. And to create this man-made, very unnatural, resource-dependent environment, it was built on that nature reserve. And a lawyer trying to stop the development unsuccessfully, I believe, described it as the destruction of an important ecosystem. And as you can imagine, there were considerable protests against the development of this golf course. Here we have some protesters hanging a doll of the Rio mayor saying that he's no friend of the environment. It's a crying shame, according to these protesters, but it's not going to have any effect rather than is not going to have any effect on the development that's going on. So you can see, in order to create these events, oftentimes it requires the development of local environments and oftentimes the destruction and degradation of the biodiversity around them. That first section where we talked about the environmental impact of sport, we went from running shoes to the Olympics. And now we're going to look at global active sport tourism, which is very different. And here's the diagram from earlier. Let's look at active sport tourism. The active part is key. It's doing things. It's going internationally to climb, hike, ski, golf, to do winter sports, and to participate in adventure tourism. And all these types of things, that's what active sport tourism is. Clearly, most of these things are centered around activities in which the environment is a key element. You climb on rocks, you hike across landscapes, you ski down mountains, you scuba dive in the water. People go to these places for the environment in which they can practice the activity, and they're going to go there, they're going to enjoy it, and you can see the lure of why people want to do this type of these types of activities, to experience the pleasure that they derive from the interaction with the environment. However, you can already imagine this creates a problem because these are numbers of people that are increasing, as I said. The leisure and discretionary income that people have is increasing, so there's more and more numbers of people who want to participate in these types of activities. One of the effects of this rising demand of environmental tourism and active sport tourism is overcrowding. And recently, Mount Everest has become the site of many deaths as more and more people are determined to engage in active sport, in an active sport lifestyle, and pursue the summiting of Mount Everest as the pinnacle of their outdoor adventures. And you can see from this image just the trail of people and a bottleneck of people trying to get to the top of the mountain, such that In 2019, 9 climbers died on Mount Everest alone. So we see this movement, and I think this issue of people dying trying to attempt to climb Mount Everest because they're stuck there. There's such a backlog of people, and they can't get to the summit quick enough, is really an effect of and a testament to the surge in this type of active sport tourism that we're talking about. The second effect would be environmental degradation, and the possibility of environmental degradation of the environment that the people want to use. And just imagine in the previous example of Mount Everest how more and more people are climbing that, what that means for the environment. So you have the overuse of trails, the overuse of hiking trails, or boat pollution to try and airplane pollution to try and get people to those active sports sites. The environment itself becomes degraded as a form of this active sport tourism. It creates various forms of pollutants and degradation of the environment as a result. And in terms of ski resorts, where people travel thousands of miles to their favorite ski resorts are suffering in two ways. For one, snow has become an issue for many of these resorts because global warming means that snow is at lower levels and is becoming increasingly rare in certain parts of the year. So you can see situations like this where there's a distinct lack of snow as a result of these heightened temperatures. The other impact comes from the overuse of its natural environment and ski runs and the degradation of ski runs year after year and what that means for the slopes. Hudson in 2004 argued that a major deterrent to the future development of the ski market comes in the form of growing environmental concerns about human and traffic congestion on the mountains and the intensive use of natural resources by skiers. You add those two things together, there's a considerable environmental dimension to this global active tourist problem that on the surface seems relatively benign, seems that you are communing with nature, but ironically it's contributing to the degradation of the environment and nature itself in the process. So there's been a negative effect of ski resorts on the environment, and there's a lack of snow and too many people using those slopes. And the solutions that the resort came up with further hurt the environment, some people might argue. Number one is the destruction of alpine vegetation. Basically, all the snow grooming machines pack down the snow that there is, and many use salt as a way to bind the snow together to create artificial slopes, and that puts salt into the biosphere and really kills local vegetation. Increased water usage from artificial snowmaking equipment is now environmentally friendly because it's using too much water, or is not environmentally friendly because it's really using too much water to artificially make that snow. Third, we have the wildlife disturbance. And that means local wildlife is destroyed because of all the various elements that are associated with creating and maintaining ski runs. And then, of course, soil erosion because of the years and years of bulldozing to clearing areas for forests. It leads to landslides, which we saw a little bit earlier, as one of the effects of clearing trees off of the mountainside. And here we can look at the environmental problems associated with ski slopes, the soil erosion being the main issue and ground surface removal, and then the erosion happens in the soil movement as well of further rain, and then that soil washing away. It creates landslides. Moving on from ski to golf, and clearly golf is an environmentally based activity, something oftentimes people search out environments to play golf in. And there are certain types of environments that are created. The two most obvious I could think of are links courses, which is a traditional environment found a lot in Scotland, where coastal dunes were used to create courses. And then in the US, there are a number of desert courses. So links is what we're going to be focusing on specifically, and an example of its environmental impact on golf and local environments. Now, as you probably know, golf is a massive business. They say it was in decline, but apparently for whatever reason, it's on an upswing again. Now, 80 million golfers worldwide, 40,000 golf courses worldwide. Golf events are worth close to $2 billion a year, and golf tourism and international golf tourism is worth more than $1 billion. So you're talking about a very big industry, and as a result, people are wanting to invest in that industry. And a good example of that is Donald Trump, who's developed a golf resort in Scotland. And it's called Trump International Golf Links. 2 courses, a golf academy, 1,500 homes, 500 private houses, and reported, and we know the history of economic impact studies, reportedly able to bring $400 million into the local economy, and $100 million a year after year. And it's supposed to bring that large amount because of the development costs in the beginning, which created about an estimated 6,000 jobs. Now, of course, much like the Olympic Games, that's the intention, that's the promise. However, there is a big controversy, not only whether the economics work out, but around this use of the Scottish coastline, because it was viewed as being very environmentally significant and important to the community. And if you watch this video clip from the documentary, You've Been Trumped, about the whole process that went around the development of this particular resort in Scotland and the role that Trump himself played and his money played, and also the environmental issues and protesters that went around it, because there was a high degree of resistance toward this development, mainly because what it meant for the environment and also the sort of interference of putting a massive golf course filled with tourists right on the Scottish coast. And the resistance here said that Donald Trump was complaining about this guy, Don Banks, because his house got in the way of Donald Trump's golf course. And he says if Trump is allowed to build on it just because he wants it and his money talks, it undermines the whole system of environmental protection in Scotland. So this issue around the golf course in Scotland became a flashpoint which linked to broader issues of environmental protection, the usage of land, because basically this was protected land. Rather like the Olympic golf course, this was protected land for various wildlife reasons that preserve the ecosystem of Scotland's precious coast. However, the money came in, and though the search for investment and the wanting to be developed an economic uplift for the area was important, there were questions about, one, whether this economic uplift would ever take place, and two, what that meant for the environment. So, as a look of the environment issues caused by the resort, number one here, the threat to the biosphere, threat to the significant sand dunes and the wildlife around it. And as a result of the building, there was a water shortage for local residents, and this is Scotland we're talking about, a global north country that was experiencing a water shortage because of the creation and maintenance of the golf course. And as with any golf courses, these two things, high levels of chemical use, fertilizers, pesticides, weed killers that damage the local environment. They leak into the water system, they damage the environments, and humans consume them in their drinking water. So here's an interesting point about an environmental issue with golf. It creates a golf monoculture that inhibits biodiversity. So golf courses, although they're supposed to be in different locations, they tend to look the same wherever they are around the world because they're created to look a particular way. And even though there's supposedly links courses and desert courses, the actual fairways, the greens, the bunkers are a golf monoculture. And that inhibits diversity because it gets rid of local biodiversity and it creates it with this very monotonous, uniform golf landscape. They are a tremendous drain on resources to preserve them, particularly those desert courses to keep them green and useful. And also the chemicals and fertilizers seep into the drinking water and really have deleterious effects, many of which we don't even know of. So golf is now a popular game in China for wealthier Chinese men and women, and there are also signs in India that golf is gaining momentum. And here we're talking about over 2 billion people taking up the sport of golf, and we can think about what that means in terms of the demand and the further investment and creation of golf courses worldwide, and how that might link to the environment that we all are interconnected to. So the developed world is looking to the developing world really as a market for golf. Over recent decades, developing countries in Southeast Asia have, often underpinned by global capitalist investment like Donald Trump and many of his cohort, increasingly turned to golf as a vehicle of the developed world, mainly from Japan, the US, and Europe, tourist revenue. So you've got many nations that are looking to develop high-end golf course resorts to attract international tourists to go play there. So that has considerable economic effects potentially as they hope to gain much economic gain from these developments, but there's also some negative effects environmentally and economically as well. And if you look at this next video here, and it's a bit old, but it's called The Golf War from over 20 years ago now. And I would only look at this if you're going to write, either if you're going to write about this topic or you're really interested in golf or golf development. It's really not a requirement. I'm not going to quiz you on this. So only look at this if you're interested in this topic assignment because it's a pretty long video. It's about 40 minutes long. But to summarize, in this Gulf War, it's all about proposed development in the Philippines. Investors wanted to create this really beautiful site in order to create a high-end golf resort that is going to attract tourists from all over the world. It was going to displace many fishermen and farmers in the area and move them off their land. And they'd been used to it for their livelihood for centuries. And this was just going to wipe it clean and build a golf course on the area that would attract out of town tourists. And so there were violent protests against this, and in the end, I think it stopped the development of the course. But Gulf Wars look at this type of struggle between developers and protesters against it in the Philippines and elsewhere around the world. So the argument for this type of development are that it stimulates local economies, anchors or other forms of development, and it really provides a service for consumer markets. So it's really all about the upping the consumer economy within this area. So this links back to capitalism and this desire to develop and grow capitalist markets and those deleterious effects on the environment that accompany it. That's really the heart of this lecture topic. There are considerable arguments against it, however, not only whether or not these economic impact studies and the effects of tourism and consumer spending are what are promised, often they are not. There are considerable arguments linked around the anti-global golf movement because of these arguments, because of the environmental effect that it has, environmental consequences, water usage, fertilizer overabundance, are all prioritized since this is vital to maintaining and developing these golf courses. Chemical usage, they leach into the water table and have very damaging effects on local environments as well. And then thirdly, this notion of golf monoculture. It inhibits biodiversity by pushing out local forms of plant and foliage that would be natural or unique to the area. Now, the social consequences that come with it as well are perhaps relevant to the Trump development, as it's forced displacement of people, eviction from the land, because they are forcibly purchased out of or removed from their land. In many cases, in this sort of golf development phenomenon, local people lose their livelihood because their livelihood was on the land. It was either fishing the land or farming the land, and employment becomes dependent on low-wage employment within these golf courses. So as a result, their cultures and communities are dissolved because they're split up and there's cultural dissolution. And I never thought about this before, but closely linked with many international sport tourism is the emergence of the sex industry around it. And there are a large number of middle-aged, upper-middle-class men who are traveling to these places from around the world, and the sex industry tends to follow from that grouping. This is what the Gulf War documentary points out. And so there's a lack of economic reinvestment. The developers don't reinvest back into the local community, and they take what we've seen in other examples of global development. They take their profit from the investment and reinvest it elsewhere. So as a result, Gulf development suffers from that leakage effect that we talked about earlier, that the local money or the money does not stay local. It leaks back out to the economy, to Donald Trump in New York or to other industrial developers around the world. Moving on to the last section here, if there's all these different forms of environmental impact that sport has, what has been the response to these concerns? How has sport as an industry and a cultural practice responded to these threats and criticisms around these environmental issues? This is where we talk about briefly environmentalism, because environmentalism has come to the fore. That's movements and organizations that are looking to protect or secure the health and future of the natural environment. And I think environmentalism, as I said very early on here, has come from being an alternative out there into perhaps being a bit more mainstream. And this is where we see it's a part and parcel of most governments, most organizations, the way they run themselves. They're keen on demonstrating a positive relationship and care for the environment, be it the EPA in the US or the UNEP or numerous other different agencies around the world. And what we see, in fact, is that the environment has become a mainstream political issue. And here we have Obama versus Romney in 2012, surfers rock the votes, environmental policies. Leading politicians become evaluated oftentimes on their environmental policies, and also the environment has become a micro-political issue. Protest groups, and we've already seen a couple of them in this topic, but here we have surfers against sewage and their protest against environmental pollution in the hydrosphere and how it's affected their practice of surfing. So they're bringing attention to the issue through their involvement and activism. Also, we have industry groups and protests, and they use environment as a political element. And here we have was what was the sustainable slopes and climate change from this group, and it's all about trying to help stop change by informing people about the problems that global warming has created for the ski industry. So what I'm trying to say is not only is the environment a political and mainstream issue, but the environment is in relation to sport as well. And as a result, sport itself and its governing bodies and corporations linked to sport are looking to develop sustainable strategies because environmental issues lead to the need to create sustainable strategies that aren't going to negatively impact the environment through the course of their practice and processes. So sustainable development has become the order of the day within the sport industry. There are three main principles of it, as we'll see here. Generational equity. So we've got an obligation, according to sustainable development assumptions, to pass on the earth in the same state that it has been in and in equal condition it was in as we inherited it. So that's probably the major thing we've got, an obligation to keep to future generations, to not pollute it or ruin it, to keep the right environment and pass it on to the future generations. There's an intergenerational equity within the concurrent movement, and we have to have respect for our environments and people's living environments around the world. We shouldn't be polluting or exploiting the environments that people are living in elsewhere. We may be environmentally friendly to our own in our local environment, but we need to think globally as well. Thirdly, transfrontier responsibility means we need to live within the limits or our local resources rather than exploiting the resources of others. Clearly linked to the second one, but we shouldn't be pillaging and exploiting the raw materials and resources and land of people around the world. We should live within our means and our own resources, and that's another form of sustainability. So these are the type of mentalities that have come to the fore in the sport industry that's linked around environmental issues and concerns. And this can be a form of environmental influence corporate responsibility. Corporations demonstrate their environmental credentials, and their responsibilities that corporations have can be articulated by embracing sustainable practice. And a great example of this is Nike, who's become very high profile in their sustainability issues. If you go on the Nike sustainability website, they have some amazing information that they provide you, and clearly you can be critical of Nike. However, they're trying to address the various issues that they've been critiqued for in the past in regard to environmental issues, sustainability, and so forth and so on. One example of this was a number of years ago, they produced the Trash Talk shoe, a shoe made out of recycled scrap waste from production facilities to produce a recycled shoe so effective that it was worn by Steve Nash of the NBA. And here we have the video that goes into this, and it demonstrates in a short video how this was in fact made. And it's quite interesting to see how the waste production is used as part of the production process in these shoes. I'm not sure they did particularly well, however. It probably demonstrates what sustainable reduction or reuse is going to look like in the future. And what Nike does is they have amazing information on the website, and if you're into the industry, you should definitely go to it and read up. But they have a sustainability index of Nike materials. Here they're looking at the upper part of the shoe and the different sustainability index of all the different materials. So you can look to see which one is more or less environmentally friendly based on these Nike MSI scores and environmental impact. So it's an incredible way that they're demonstrating which materials are more sustainable than others. And now they're the leaders and in some cases they're the leaders in responding to the criticism and demonstrating sustainable practice and strategies in the shoe industry. Of course, another is product recycling that is very popular within the sporting goods industry, and this comes to the fore. This is Puma and Nike and Adidas, and they're encouraging product recycling as an obligation that they can have free recycling, because if you think about it, with our increased shortened life cycles of shoes, we can recycle and buy another pair. I think that's part and parcel of the idea as well, but it does demonstrate a sustainable element to their practice. But it's not just the shoe industry, because the United Nations has got a very prominent environmental program, part of which is all about sport and the environment. And you can go to this site and see some very interesting things. They play an important role in promoting and developing an environmentally friendly sport facility and the manufacturing of environmentally friendly sporting goods. Because we don't really talk about it here, but the manufacturing of environmentally friendly sport facilities, that have a low carbon footprint on the planet is something that's very important to us as well. So the UN has recognized the sport and the environment issue and is trying to emphasize the construction of facilities in a carbon neutral way. And so is the Olympics, which has had environmental and sustainability as part of its charter since 1996. And then in 1999, it adopted Agenda 21, which you can read here, in which they are really seeking to integrate sustainability into all aspects of their operations. So you can see as the environmental issues have come to the fore, they've been taken up by the Olympic movement in a very obvious way. In 2012, this was an interesting document from the IOC. You can get the sustainability through sport. It's a PDF that you can get directly. And here, bringing it up to date, each Olympic bid has very definite strategies and plans for sustainability management. And these are a number of different forms of sustainability, one of which is centered around the environment. And this is one thing that you can go and look back on for Rio 2016 and the Olympic plan and the key environmental dimensions of Rio's sustainability and management. And of course, so that's the Olympics. But UEFA, the governing body of football in Europe, is doing these things as well. And I thought it was quite strange. And they said this a while ago, and they've changed their plan quite a bit. But this was 2006. UEFA stated, quote, "It is the responsibility of fans to compensate their individual carbon emissions when they travel to an away game, and we encourage them to use public transport whenever possible," end quote. Now, this has changed very much in more recent times. UEFA has taken up that notion of carbon offsetting. So it does, it's offsetting as a part and parcel of the flights and the cost of flights that incur carbon emissions to get fans to the game. Now this has also been taken up by the World Cup, and we've woken up really to the global event in 2014. BP, of all people, set up a not-for-profit carbon management program in which ticket holders at the 2014 World Cup, they could sign up for this free campaign where they would measure their carbon that was used from coming anywhere in the world to attend the event. It was calculated, and BP would offset that carbon and hopefully reduce the carbon footprint from the games by planting a tree or doing something else to benefit the environment. So the target was to get 50,000 people to join in, and FIFA also offsetting approximately 250,000 tons of carbon associated with its operations and travel to the tournament. So in this way, you can see the carbon that is being used is being offset in multiple different ways by these organizations and corporations to try and get the events to be more carbon neutral. So here it is: reduce carbon, replace it, and neutralize it. It equals BP's target of neutralization. So that was the idea and attempt to address the problem of environmental impact of pollution from travel to these tournaments. And so it's quite an innovation, and it's going through, and perhaps we're going to see more of these in the future. And lastly, let's talk about this. This is BP target neutral of greenwashing, because greenwashing is certainly a factor within environmental issues and the environmental concern. And greenwashing is simply the spread of information by an organization, be it BP or the IOC or Nike, designed to present an environmentally concerned and responsible brand identity. For example, BP is an oil company. They contribute to the emission of greenhouse gases and the reduction and the overuse of fossil fuels. But they advertise that they're doing all of this to this carbon offsetting, so they're positioning themselves as caring about the environment. Now, why is this done? Well, they argue they greenwash in order to mask prior, current, or future environmental abuses. It presents BP as caring about the environment as they ironically contribute to the degradation of it. Now, if you're talking about BP, an oil company that pollutes the globe on a constant basis and was really responsible for the pollution of the Gulf a few years ago with a massive oil spill, they can recreate a sort of branded identity. And so you can see how they're trying to greenwash by becoming associated with a positive approach to the environment that is designed to offset, if you like, prior, current, and future environmental abuses that the company has been associated with. Rather, like Nike, you'd say, is perhaps doing this as well. Another is the 2012 Olympics, which were described as perhaps the greenest ever. And we talked a little bit about this previously, as they were heavily linked to these companies: Dow, BP, Rio Tinto. They're all chemical. Dow is a chemical company, BP is an oil company. and Rio Tinto is a mining company. So three corporations that have been heavily criticized for their environmental impacts and policies are now associated through their sponsorship of these green games that were associated with renewable energy, zero waste production, carbon neutrality, using sustainable materials, and really helping to clean up the East London area. So that's London 2012. And here's another example of greenwashing, perhaps, and it's from World Cup 2014, and it involves this Fulico, who is the mascot for the World Cup. And Fulico is the name that's a mixture of fuel and ecology. And Fulico is a Brazilian armadillo, which is a highly endangered species within Brazil. So in doing this, in presenting this as the mascot of the World Cup, you can see what FIFA is doing. What the Brazilian organizing committee is doing is aligning themselves to issues of environmental concern in biodiversity and endangered species. So it's showing its green credentials by having this environmentally relevant mascot. Not only does the World Cup benefit from that greenwashing, but also Coca-Cola, which sponsored them, the promotions and events around Fulico, and how he was presented through the World Cup tournament. So this greenwashing is an example of environmental issues being brought into sport and commerce. But in a way, you could say that it was trying to present a better, more greener, more environmentally friendly brand image, both for the World Cup and Coca-Cola, both which have questionable environmental records in terms of the benefits of or their negative impacts. For example, building the World Cup stadium in the rainforest of Manaus contributed directly to the reduction of biodiversity and the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. And here's the last example I've got. This is perhaps up for debate, and this is Shell and Peel, who are inspiring future energy scientists within the soccer pitch in Brazil. And it's pretty amazing. As you run onto the pitch, it helps to create energy that lights that allows youth soccer to play in the night or through the night. So here's something that the world is being changed for its benefit, but from a renewable energy source that is being sponsored by Shell. Again, Shell has been heavily criticized for its environmental policies. And so there you go. There's greenwashing, Shell, and sports all tied together for the 2014 World Cup. So the responses to these environmental concerns are within the sport industry are actually pretty clear, and they're going to increase because the need to demonstrate your sustainability as a sporting entity is important. Whether you're a sporting company, you're making sporting goods, you're a team or an event, sustainability and environmental issues are concerns that you're going to have to deal with. In summary, I'm not sure if it appears like it, but I believe that this is one of the most globally interconnected aspects that we've talked about in this entire class, because anything that happens in the environment has truly global interconnections and potential impacts all the way around the world. And the environmental impact of sport, whether it's bio, hydro, litho, or atmosphere, even at the local level, can have global ramifications. And I think we've looked at various examples, but this is a massive topic, and we've really only scratched the surface. And if you're going to do the topic assignment on this, you're going to have to do more detail and more digging if you choose to write about it. But clearly there is a relationship between sport and the environment that links us around the world, whether we realize it or not. Something that goes on within Brazil and India and China can have clear environmental impacts on us living in the US and vice versa. Now the question is whether global sports in the future will be able to develop in a way that's going to improve or hurt the natural environment. The way it's going previously up to this point, we could argue that sport in general was a contributor to the degradation or the pollution of the environment and a generally negative impact on that environment. Now we have to think about this, and how can we develop a model of the sporting industry that doesn't have these negative aspects, that is carbon neutral or even has positive effects on the natural environment? I think this is something that we all need to figure out because clearly if we don't solve these problems, then sport will ironically cease to exist in the future because it's dependent on the environment to stage its activities. And so understanding the present, again, is really important towards shaping, influencing, and creating the future. So I challenge all of you to think about this. Think about that relationship between sport and the environment as you all go out, many of you becoming sport managers, and will look to create positive, effective change for the future.